Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Adam Lang. Australian companies are facing a lot of challenges right now. Staff shortages, rising costs, interest rates, energy prices, cyber threats. The list is pretty extensive, and now we can add the challenge of working capital as well, with average working capital cycles lengthening by more than 5 days in 2022. That means an additional $11.1 billion is effectively locked up for Australian companies. Jason Ireland and Sean Wiles are partners at McGrathNicol Advisory, and they're the co-authors of the 10th Annual Working Capital Report. McGrathNicol is a supporter of this podcast. Jason, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Great to be here.
And Sean, good morning and welcome back to Fear and Greed too.
G'day, Adam. Thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure. Jason, let me start with you. I mentioned a couple of the statistics and they are pretty confronting. But let's first rewind a bit. When we're referring to working capital, what are we actually talking about?
Yes, so simple question, sometimes a complicated answer, but I'll do my best. So at its most basic, it's the link between your profit and loss statement, so your revenue and your costs, and your actual cash flow. So the elements of that are accounts receivable, so sales that you've made but you haven't yet collected the money. Accounts payable, so costs you've incurred but you haven't yet paid the money. And inventory, stock sitting on your shelves that hopefully one day will convert into cash. Taken collectively, that's the working capital of a business. It's often measured in dollars, so you might hear someone say, I've $100 million tied up in working capital. It's actually better tracked in days because that tells you how long you have it tied up in working capital. So a long working capital cycle means you have a long time to wait between your profit becoming your cash. So this lengthening of the working capital cycle that we've seen in our report means cash has been tied up for longer in businesses.
And Jason, just to be super clear, how does worker capital differ from cash flow? Is it the length of time between the two?
That's right. So the cash flow is actually money flowing into your bank account, whereas your working capital is a sale that you've made, but that period of time between when you make it and you collect it, it's in working capital. It's tied up. Inventory might even be an easier one, Adam. So there is inventory sitting on your shelf. You've invested capital and cost into buying or making that. So it's sitting there in working capital. One day it will become cash, but not yet.
And Sean, why has the working capital cycle blown out by so much in the last year? Does that relate back to supply chains?
Yeah, the cycle did blow out, Adam, as you mentioned, 5.3 days, and Jason explained, I suppose, some of the sort of contextual reasons behind it. The lengthening of the cycle was the most significant we've seen in the 10 years that we've published our report, and supply chains were the root cause. Adam, our sampled companies held over 10 days more inventory on average than they did the prior year, and they also collected from their customers more slowly. So they had the dual pressure of holding more inventory but getting paid more slowly for the sales they were making.
Right. And so, Sean, are you seeing an impact on how companies change their approach to working capital management?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, Adam. Close to 80% of our sample reported an increase in net working capital as a proportion of revenue. So what that means is that a higher working capital load was required by those companies to support their trading activity to generate their revenue. And this has clearly brought working capital management more into focus, particularly in terms of getting the basics right. You know, we've seen good process, clear roles and responsibilities, and interestingly, a shift to the use of technology mentioned by the CFOs that we've spoken to and surveyed as part of our report. And that's meant an increase in the use of things like data analytics and working capital dashboards, which have sort of supplemented those basics of working capital management.
Sean, just a quick one on that. Are you sensing that part of it was because of the risks of supply chain management that people thought it was prudent to have longer cycles involved, or was it not as deliberate as that?
I think when you talk about it in terms of inventory management, and Jason and I sort of saw this within the numbers, there was what we saw a caution in terms of the way that businesses manage their inventory load in particular to avoid stockouts. They also had to do so, obviously, with the disruptions to supply chain that we've seen and reported so widely. So I think on one hand, there was that deliberate move by businesses to make sure they had enough stock to sort of bed themselves through the uncertainty. On the other hand, we saw businesses in some sectors really impacted by supply chain disruptions in terms of getting their product out the door and out of the country. So they were stuck with some stock that they probably didn't think that they would have and would have sold if it weren't for those supply chain disruptions.
So some things were in their control and some things were not. Were you seeing a difference in how this applied to smaller businesses that might have had more limited reserves?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we're often asked that because our research really focuses on the larger businesses. And we saw those larger companies pay their suppliers more slowly in 2022. And we often see that the brunt of this is borne by smaller businesses. So it just magnifies the need for them, Adam, we think, to run a really tight ship when it comes to managing working capital, fostering relationships with customers and suppliers. It sounds easy, but that's where it really starts and where the rubber hits the road for good working capital management and agreeing terms with those customers and suppliers that best support their cash flow.
Investing more energy in those relationships so you can get through those periods.
That's right.
Stay with me. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Jason Ireland and Sean Wiles, partners at McGrathNicol Advisory. Jason, if we have a look at a few sectors in particular, construction, food and beverage and retail, starting with construction, this is one of the most working capital intensive sectors, and we've seen some really high profile collapses in the last 12 months. What does your report say about construction?
You're exactly right. There have been high profile failures in this sector and a lot of publicity about potential for more. 2022 was a really busy but a very difficult year for the construction sector. What our survey showed that 75% of the companies we looked at actually saw an increase in revenue, but only 58% of them were able to turn it into an increase in profit. Construction and engineering is a relatively low margin sector, so it's all about cash. It's all about managing that cycle. What's interesting from the data is that the construction and engineering sector actually has the longest time between when it makes a sale and when it collects it. So it has the longest collection cycle. And in fact, that collection cycle is longer than the cycle it needs to pay its suppliers on. So there's actually just a structural gap in that sector, which is why cash flow is so important. So managing your cycle really tight is very, very key for that sector. And it's been difficult because you've got supply chain issues where you've got your own suppliers in the sector wanting to be paid more quickly, and you've got projects which are disrupted, which means you are getting paid more slowly. So it's been a tough year. We saw in that sector that collection cycle blow out by over a week, which is a huge imposition on the cash flows of those businesses.
And Jason, is Australia unique in this regard? How does that compare globally?
Australia is actually pretty good in the construction and engineering. Australian businesses have become quite good at their collection cycle. So while I said it increased, it's no more than any other of the markets that we look at. So we looked at Asia, we looked at the EU, and we looked at the US. So Australian construction businesses are actually pretty good at their working capital management.
So, Jason, looking at food and beverage, and that's another interesting sector because it also was hit very hard by COVID, but things do seem to be improving.
Yes, it's one Sean mentioned earlier about trying to manage your inventory cycle. It has the highest inventory load of any sector, and it saw the largest increase. I think a combination of things. Really jagged demand, so getting your inventory matched to your demand has been really difficult for food and beverage, and therefore that sort of disconnect has created, in some instances, companies where they're holding too much. But also there's been other areas where we've seen, okay, well, we're opening up, we're coming into a higher demand part of the year, or as I said, lockdowns are being lifted, so people geared up. So a really material increase over 23 days, over 3 weeks in inventory being held for longer.
So, Jason, the last of the sectors, we've talked a bit about construction, food and beverage. What about retail? Have supply chain problems affected working capital in retail too?
No doubt. Retail's your other large inventory holding sector. So it carries over 130 days of inventory, so months of inventory. And it actually increased by, again, over 3 weeks. So a combination of factors there, supply chain being really difficult to manage, but also demand being very difficult to manage. And if you think about most of these companies reporting around June, the retail sector, because of that supply chain difficulty they've been seeing, have had to place their bets earlier this year so that they're certain that they will have inventory in stores for Christmas. So that has just naturally led to higher inventory carrying.
Sean Wiles, partner at McGrathNicol Advisory. I'm going to turn to you now for perhaps one of the more challenging parts of the interview. I'm going to ask you about what's ahead of us. Your survey of company leaders found that 95% believe working capital management has become harder in the last 2 years. But interestingly, nearly 90% of them are confident about how their business cash flow over the next 12 months can be managed. Where do you think this confidence is coming from?
Yeah, Adam, it's the first time we've run this survey as part of our analysis. So it was good, I think, to get that sort of broad cross-section of feedback from across all parts of the market. So over 300 CFOs and business leaders were included in that survey. And I think, to your first point, the main undercurrent that we saw from the survey was that it will continue to be hard for businesses over the next 12 months. You know, where we take that positivity or confidence in terms of cash flow actually came in one of the statistics that we saw in that 80% of respondents that had changed their working capital management practices over the last year were seeing improvements. So there was reward for effort, if you like. The ones or the businesses that had put the time into tightening their practices, as we were talking about earlier, really managing those relationships with suppliers and customers, we're seeing the positive impact of that, which I think in our view sort of translates, I think, into the hope of stronger cash flows over the next 12 months or maybe past that.
Sean, did you get the sense that maybe we're getting better at it, that we'd been through some really tough times and we'd learned how to do it better?
I think, Adam, COVID taught businesses a lot about how to manage working capital. Obviously, the government helped as well with managing cash flow. But we definitely saw in the early parts of COVID that businesses faced with that level of uncertainty had to, as I said earlier, get back to basics. They had to communicate with their customers more. They had to manage their suppliers better. They had to really look at the way that they purchase. So they changed their purchasing behaviours. They looked at optimal level of stock. They looked at costs across the business and how all these things interrelated. So I think it really forced an element of laziness out of some businesses and got back to that sort of basic, what makes our business drive, what makes it effective from both a revenue generation, cost management and working capital management point of view. And I think Jason and I are seeing a lot of businesses take those learnings now into a post-COVID environment, albeit with a bunch of other challenges when it comes to supply chain constraints, the war in the Ukraine and so forth. So there's definitely, I think we're seeing it on the radar, working capital management, rightfully at the table with other important parts of managing a business.
That's great insight. And Jason Ireland, turning back to you, how important is it for businesses to collect money faster and in turn pay suppliers faster as well?
Yeah, let's look at the first bit of that firstly. I mean, what business doesn't want cash more often coming in faster? And the second bit of it is actually gives you more options. And so being able to pay your suppliers faster means you're a good counterparty to deal with. And so when there is difficulty in that supply chain, you're hoping that you get an advantage because you've been a good payer. You've met all the terms. So it just provides you with a comparative advantage. Collecting more quickly shores up your supply chain. In a difficult supply chain, you want to be at the top of the list. And being at the top of the list comes with paying quickly, on time, each time, regularly. And you can do that when your coffers are full.
Sean, beyond the ASX-listed companies and other large businesses, what do you think are the key messages here for the small and medium-sized enterprises?
Yeah, I think to summarise it, Adam, it's to be disciplined, embed processes and protocols that give those businesses the best chance to hold the right level of stock and get paid on time. I think interestingly, what comes out of our data most years is that for those that can do it, there's a real material competitive advantage to be gained by implementing best practice. And our analysis shows that this is only magnified in times of volatility and disruption like what we've seen over the last couple of years.
They're great insights. Jason, would you add anything else?
I think discipline is the right thing. We've seen, and you saw from the survey results, that people that have actually implemented a process have seen results and they feel more confident.
That's great advice. Jason and Sean, thank you both very much for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Adam.
That was Jason Ireland and Sean Wiles, partners at McGrathNicol Advisory, which is a supporter of this podcast. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Adam Lang. Enjoy your day.